1. Introduction, the significance of Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10 is widely recognized in biblical scholarship as the Table of Nations. This chapter meticulously describes how, after the Great Flood, humanity repopulated, spread across the earth, and diversified into various nations, languages, and cultures through Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It depicts the fulfillment of God's command to Noah and his sons to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth, Genesis 9:1, thereby simultaneously illustrating humanity's common origin and its diversity. This chapter is intimately connected with the subsequent narrative of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, laying the groundwork for God's sovereignty and judgment in the dispersion of humanity, and for the subsequent plan of salvation. The account in Genesis chapter 10 is not merely a historical genealogy, it suggests that God's creative and sovereign plan extends throughout the entire history of humanity. 2. Summary. Genesis chapter 10, known as the Table of Nations, details the repopulation of humanity and its dispersion across the earth after the Great Flood. This chapter vividly portrays the fulfillment of God's command to Noah's sons, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. It systematically lists the descendants of Noah's 3 sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, and shows how they formed various peoples, languages, and nations. Specifically, the descendants of Japheth primarily spread to Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and the coastal regions of Western Europe, forming maritime nations. The descendants of Ham settled in northeast Africa and Palestine, and their lineage saw the development of early civilizations and kingdoms. The descendants of Shem settled in Mesopotamia and southwest Arabia. Shem's lineage is particularly important, as it later connected to the Semitic peoples, including the nation of Israel, where the promises of God's covenant would be fulfilled. In this chapter, Nimrod, a descendant of Ham, is particularly highlighted. He is described as a mighty hunter before the Lord, or against the Lord, and is credited with building cities like Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Kolna, establishing early kingdoms. His emergence suggests the development of human civilization and, at times, humanity's drive for power that goes against God's will. Nimrod's influence is emphasized as a founder of empires that would later pose problems for Israel, such as Babylon and Assyria. The main message of Genesis chapter 10 is the unity of all humanity, derived from a common ancestor, Noah, and the diversity of languages, cultures, and geographical locations as part of God's creative plan. This chapter suggests God's sovereign involvement in the distribution and settlement of humanity, serving as a setting for God's plan of salvation, including the later story of the nation of Israel. However, it also shows that Noah's descendants were not always faithful to God's command, and that there was a tendency for humans to rebel, as exemplified by Nimrod, implying the continued presence of human sin. This chapter highlights the reality that humanity tends to forget God's commands and pursue its own desires. 3. Catholic interpretation. Catholic interpretation of Genesis chapter 10 primarily emphasizes the common origin and fundamental familial unity of humanity, and the orderly arrangement of nations by divine providence. The Biblical Commentary of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCB, delves deeply into the theological significance of this chapter. Genesis 10:1 forms the fourth formula of the priestly formulas that constitute the first part of Genesis, introducing the population growth and city building of the world. Genesis 10:2 to 11-9. This structure indicates that while Genesis 4-9 focuses on the first command to humanity, be fruitful and multiply, Genesis 1:28, chapters 10 to 11 focus on the second command, fill the earth and subdue it. Here, subdue it is interpreted as each nation occupying the land assigned to it by God. Genesis 9:19 already states that all nations derived from Noah's 3 sons, and this sense of universal origin is repeated in multiple places in chapter 10. The premise of this chapter, as indicated in Deuteronomy 32:8-9, is that all nations have land assigned to them by God. This provides a perspective that the geographical spread and settlement of humanity were not merely a natural consequence of population growth, but rather part of God's active intervention and orderly plan. A theological perspective is presented, suggesting that the migration of peoples and the formation of nations in the ancient world were not driven solely by chance or human will, but unfolded under God's sovereign providence. This connects to the broader biblical theme that God is the ultimate ruler of history and geography, and that even boundaries between nations are part of God's plan. The number of nations is traditionally considered to be 70, not counting Noah and his sons, and counting Sidon only once, a number found in other biblical traditions such as Judges 8:30 and Luke 10:1-17. Furthermore, according to Genesis 46:27 and Exodus 1:5, Israel also numbered 70, suggesting that Israel in some sense represents the nations of the earth. This correspondence in numbers emphasizes Israel's special role in God's universal plan of salvation. Israel was chosen as a specific people not merely for their own sake, but with the purpose of representing all nations on earth, and ultimately, for God's blessings to extend to the entire world through them. This serves as a theological bridge, connecting the Old Testament concept of Israel's chosenness to the universal salvation through Christ in the New Testament. It highlights a consistent plan where God, while choosing a specific people, always has all of humanity in view. This chapter classifies the various peoples known to ancient Israelites, and it is theologically significant in emphasizing the basic familial unity of all peoples on earth. Relationships between peoples are based on linguistic, geographical, or political grounds. Genesis 10:31. The classification and geographical distribution of the peoples are as follows. Descendants of Japheth, Genesis 10:2-5, generally understood to be Indo-European peoples located north and west of Mesopotamia and Syria. Examples include Gomer, Sumerians, Madai, Medes, Javan, Greeks, Ashkenaz, Indo-European peoples, later referring to Eastern European Jews, Elisha, Cyprus, Kittim, inhabitants of Cyprus, and Rhodanim, inhabitants of Rhodes. Descendants of Ham, Genesis 10:6-20, considered Hamitic-speaking peoples of North Africa. This includes Cush, biblical Ethiopia, Nubia, or the Kassid Kingdom, Mizraim, Lower Egypt, Put, Punt in East Africa or Libya, and Canaan, though Semitic-speaking, included as a descendant of Ham due to being formerly under Hamitic Egyptian rule. Nimrod, a descendant of Cush, described as a mighty hunter in the eyes of the Lord. His kingdom began in Babel, Erech, Akkad, and the land of Shinar, ancient Babylonia, modern southern Iraq. He is identified as the first conqueror of Babylonia and possibly Tukulti-Ninurta I, 13th century BCE, a famous city builder. Descendants of Shem, Genesis 10:21-31, considered Semitic-speaking peoples of Mesopotamia, Syria, and Arabia. This includes Zebah, ancestor of the Hebrews, and Peleg, whose name is associated with the Hebrew Niplega, meaning the earth was divided in his time. This chapter is generally considered to be a composite of Japheth, J, material, Genesis 10:8-19, 21, 24-30, and priestly, P, material, Genesis 10:1-7, 20, 22-23, 31-32. This source-critical perspective suggests the importance of understanding the Table of Nations not as a strictly historical or ethnographic record in the modern sense, but rather as a text with a theological purpose. This composite nature is considered to be the reason why some Arabian tribes are listed as descendants of both Ham and Shem. Overlaps and apparent inconsistencies are seen as a result of the text integrating different traditions to ultimately convey a unified message of humanity's universal origin and God's sovereignty. This understanding encourages a more sophisticated approach to biblical interpretation, where the Bible is seen not merely as a history book but primarily as a conveyor of theological truths as divine revelation. Protestant interpretation. Protestant interpretation of Genesis chapter 10 focuses on God's sovereignty and providence extending to all nations, the common origin and diversity of humanity, and especially, through its connection with the Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis chapter 11, how human sin and God's judgment ultimately demonstrate the glory of Jesus Christ. Protestant interpretations emphasize that God providentially guides human history and has sovereignty over all nations. As the Creator, God owns all people, and He can provide salvation to people from every nation, tribe, language, and background, no matter how far they have strayed from Him. The examples of Noah, lying drunk in his tent, and Nimrod, a mighty hunter against the Lord, show that God pursues people and offers salvation and redemption regardless of their current state. The fact that God later sent the prophet Jonah to Nineveh, built by Nimrod, and that Nineveh repented, demonstrates God's mercy and His persistent pursuit of people. The Table of Nations serves as a reminder that humanity, despite its diversity, is unified under one Creator. Since all humanity shares a common ancestor in Noah, and thus Adam, all people are created in God's image and possess inherent dignity and worth. This rejects any ideology that seeks to divide people along ethnic lines. Genesis chapter 10, unlike Genesis chapter 5 which focused on genealogy, emphasizes geographical dispersion and the establishment of ancient nations and peoples. While Genesis chapter 10 describes the spread of the nations, Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel, explains the origin of that spread as a result of God's judgment. Moses did not arrange these accounts chronologically. The structure of this narrative highlights a crucial theological point. If chapter 10 were purely chronological, it might be read as humanity obediently dispersing according to God's command. However, by placing chapter 11 after it, the author emphasizes that the dispersion was a result of a deeper cause, human rebellion and divine intervention. This understanding illuminates the truth that God's sovereign plan can be accomplished even through human sin and God's judgment. The fundamental biblical teaching is emphasized that human actions, even rebellious ones, cannot thwart God's ultimate will. God commanded Noah's family to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth, Genesis 9:1, but instead of dispersing, people began to gather. The sin of humanity at Babel was to build a city and a tower reaching to the heavens, to make a name for themselves, and to avoid scattering. This was rooted in the inner sins of love for praise and love for security. God confused their language and scattered them over the face of the earth to limit their ability to unite in rebellion against Him. Nimrod, Genesis 10:8-12, is described as mighty, but this was not a compliment. He is characterized as arrogant, forceful, greedy, and violent. He built Babel and Nineveh, which later became the capitals of Babylon and Assyria, causing great problems for Israel. Nimrod is not merely a historical figure but functions as a theological archetype. His ambition to build a kingdom and make a name for himself directly contrasts with God's command to fill the earth and trust in Him. He symbolizes humanity's tendency to pursue self-glory and autonomy independent of God, suggesting the establishment of earthly power structures that oppose divine authority. This understanding provides a theological explanation for the suffering Israel later experienced from Babylon and Assyria, rooted in Nimrod's early rebellious spirit. It establishes a recurring biblical theme of human empires against God, ultimately culminating in Babylon as a symbol of all systems hostile to God in Revelation. Nimrod showed no sign of worshipping the true God. He lived for himself and is largely forgotten today. The message is emphasized: don't be a Nimrod, live for God. In Genesis chapter 9, Noah's son Ham dishonored Noah by not covering his nakedness, and Noah cursed Ham through his descendant Canaan. Moses' emphasis on the descendants of Ham, the Canaanites, is because Israel was destined to enter the land of Canaan and bring God's judgment upon them. However, this interpretation also highlights the important principle that descent does not determine destiny. For example, Uriah the Hittite, a Canaanite, and thus under the curse, was drawn to God's people despite being a pagan and laid down his life to protect the king of Israel. This understanding deepens the comprehension of God's righteousness and grace beyond mere genealogical determinism. It suggests that even if a curse is pronounced upon a lineage, it does not prevent individual salvation or a personal relationship with God. This principle is crucial for the universality of the gospel. God's plan of salvation is not limited by ethnic origin or historical curses, it extends to all who turn to Him. This foreshadows the New Testament's emphasis that faith, not lineage, is the basis for belonging to God's people, making the gospel truly inclusive. It also serves as a refutation against misinterpreting the curse on Canaan as a justification for racial prejudice. Human sin and God's judgment at the Tower of Babel ultimately bring glory to Jesus Christ. God's judgment of language confusion at Babel is presented as ultimately magnifying Jesus' authority, glorifying the gospel, and leading to more magnificent worship in heaven. This is a powerful example of God's reversal or redemptive irony. What appears to be a punitive act, the dispersion of humanity, the confusion of languages, is reframed as a necessary step in God's grander salvation narrative. The diversity that arose from sin and judgment becomes the very canvas upon which the universal power of the gospel is depicted. If there had been only one language, the global spread of the gospel would not have appeared so evident and glorious. This understanding shows that God can weave even human rebellion and its consequences into a tapestry that ultimately highlights His wisdom, power, and the inclusiveness of His salvation plan. It culminates in eternity in the form of multi-ethnic, multilingual worship of Christ. Specifically, Jesus claims authority over all language groups, Matthew 28:18-19. He can call people from every ethnic group to worship Him. The linguistic diversity created by Babel makes the gospel more glorious because the gospel has the power to penetrate every language and ethnic group, Romans 1:16. John Piper states, "If there had been no diversity of languages, if there had been no catastrophic sin of Babel and its judgment, the global glory of Christ's gospel would not shine as beautifully as it does in the prism of thousands of languages." Revelation 5:9 and 7-9-10 describe a great multitude from every tribe and language and people and nation standing before the throne, praising God and the Lamb. This diverse chorus would be far more glorious and beautiful than if there were only one language and one people. The Babel narrative teaches that humanity should have focused on God, not self-accomplishment. The tower symbolizes the fatal delusion of all man-made religions that humans can reach God through their own efforts. In contrast, the gospel of Jesus Christ is unique in that God comes down to man and freely offers grace to those who repent and believe in Jesus. 5. Conclusion, common ground and divergences in interpretation. Catholic and Protestant interpretations of Genesis chapter 10 share many commonalities in emphasizing humanity's common origin and diversity, yet they exhibit distinct differences in specific theological foci and emphases. Common ground. Both recognize Genesis chapter 10 as the table of nations, understanding it to detail the repopulation and global dispersion of humanity from Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, after the Great Flood. Both emphasize both the unity and diversity of humanity, where diverse nations, languages, and cultures originated from a common ancestor. Both recognize Nimrod as a powerful figure who built early civilizations and kingdoms. Both share the understanding that God is sovereignly involved in the distribution and settlement of humanity. Divergences. Connection to Genesis chapter 11, Tower of Babel. Protestants strongly emphasize that the dispersion of nations was a result of God's judgment against human rebellion, offering a theological perspective that God's sovereign intervention accomplishes His purposes even through human sin. In contrast, Catholics emphasize that Genesis chapters 10 to 11 represent the fulfillment of God's command to fill the earth and subdue it, highlighting the orderly settlement where each nation occupies the land assigned by God. While the Babel narrative is mentioned, the direct emphasis on dispersion as a result of judgment is not as strong as in Protestant interpretations. Role and symbolism of Nimrod. Protestants emphasize Nimrod as a mighty hunter against the Lord, an arrogant and rebellious figure, seeing him as an archetype of kingdoms and power drives that oppose God, or a precursor to the Babylonian spirit. His story offers a lesson that self-centered pursuits are ultimately forgotten. Catholics recognize Nimrod as a powerful city builder and mention his potential as a conqueror of Babylonia, but they do not emphasize his rebellious character or symbolic meaning as strongly as Protestants do. Nuances in theological focus. Catholics focus on the number 70 for the nations and the concept of Israel representing the nations, emphasizing the continuity of God's universal plan of salvation from the Old Testament to the New. They also refer to the composite source material of the text, Japheth in priestly documents, to explain its theological editorial intent. Protestants, on the other hand, deeply focus on the principle that descent does not determine destiny, for example, the example of Uriah despite the curse on Canaan, and how the judgment at Babel ultimately demonstrates the authority of Jesus Christ and the universal glory of the gospel. They emphasize the gospel's power to transcend all linguistic and ethnic barriers. These commonalities and divergences highlight how both denominations derive different theological truths and practical lessons from the same biblical text. It can be said that Catholicism places its unique emphasis on order and universal structure, while Protestantism focuses on human sin and God's sovereign plan of salvation, and the power of the gospel centered on Jesus Christ.